We have the kiddos with us, and I realize that. Let me turn on my shot collar here. So I will try to move along fairly quickly this morning. And what I want to do this morning in our series on David, and some people are like, well, we're going a long time on this one. That's because every week we find something new in David's life, whether it's a woman of great character that he winds up marrying, or the way he handles failure and fault. Today we're going to look at what I want to do today is I want to give you a panoramic view of David's life. In fact, that's what I'm titled the message today, David's Life in Panoramic View. And what I mean by that is we're now at about our halfway point in his life. And I want to kind of give you some things that I think will help you kind of start putting this whole picture together of this life. Because remember, the New Testament says these stories were written for us as an example that we should follow in their steps, or not follow in their steps, right? So what I want to do is the subtitle is New King, New Throne, Same Lord. Because that is exactly the truth. Is that and this is, I think, a very apropos message for where we are at right now. In our country, we're looking for a new king, a new throne, but we still have the same Lord. Now, some of us, I know we're moving to Ireland. If certain people, something happens there. But we need to understand, no matter who is on the throne, God is the same Lord. And they had to put up with this time of Saul, who was wicked and rotten, right? And we've kind of had to put up with our time of Saul, too, as far as I'm concerned. But let's just do a general survey of David's life. Now, because we're at the halfway point, it's just a good place to stop, look back, look at where he's at, and where is he going. Because again, I think that's what's going to help you really put the whole package together. And because I'm going to be talking about some things in his life, specifically things that we can learn as we go on. And in order to do that, I think to get a big picture is going to kind of help us just a little bit. And that's important, I think, in our lives, is that every now and then we look at where we've been, we look at where we're at, and where we are going. All right? And if we don't do that, we kind of lose perspective in life. And that's God's perspective. He sees the big picture. Sometimes we need to step back and do that exact same thing. So far we've looked at David's life from 17 years old to 30. At 17 is when God called him from the sheepfold. All right? That's when he called him from the pasture of being a young shepherd. And then he is on the run as a fugitive and, trains all these guys and has all these battles, and he's revered throughout the land as a great man of God and a great warrior. And this is between 17 and 30. And I'm going to show you that in a snapshot. Now, these are pictures that I've been showing you all along, and they'll kind of start making sense now because we're talking about from the pasture to the palace. This is 17 to 30. Okay? And by the way, a Jewish man was not considered to be a man until he was 30. Right? And that's when Jesus' ministry started. That's pretty much when everybody's ministry started, unless you're Josiah and you're king at 8 years old, right? Okay, now this is a slide I've been showing you because you see he's going from being a shepherd and to a king, and what we've been looking at is everything in between of what is it? This cave that he lived in, these failures, this backsliddenness. There's a lot of things that caused him to grow and become the man he was so that he was ready to be the king. Now I'm going to give you, I'm going to read a verse to you, and I'll put it up here. Psalm 78, 70 through 72. Now this verse, in 3 verses, you can earmark 70 years of life. David lived to 70. And you can see all 70 years in just these 3 verses. This is what it says. He chose his servant David, calling him from the sheep pens. He took David from tending the ewes and the lambs and made him the shepherd of Jacob's descendants, Israel. Right? God's own people, Israel. And David shepherded them with integrity of his heart. With the integrity of his heart. With skillful hands he led them. We're going to look at some of that this morning. What is that skillful hands and the integrity of his heart? What is all of that? But in verse 70, there's the 17 through 30. He chose him from the pens, or the sheep pens, and led him to the throne. That's 17 to 30. Verse 71 is 30 years old, he takes the throne. Verse 72 is 30 to 70 years old. all wrapped up in this one little verse of Scripture. Okay, so now, so if you just stop to think about it, there are 3 mountain peaks in his life, 17, 30, and 70. Okay? So we're looking at everything in between, that dash between the, on the tombstone, you got the date of their birth and the date of their death, and we're looking at that dash, right? Isn't that what really matters in our lives, is that dash? How we live that dash? Or how we waste that dash? Because what matters is not the birth date and the death date. And everybody has one of those, by the way. What matters is everything in between. Now, one of the things that you're going to see is, let me give you just a quick, hopefully you can see this. It's a little bit small. I'm going to give you just a quick snapshot. This would be the entire book of 1 Samuel. All right, but you have, so what we've been concerned with right here is Saul being rejected by God, and then David is chosen the king. And then we've been looking at Saul's apostasy, his depression, his personal despair, and now his suicide. Now, in some chapters previous to what we're talking about today, Saul and Jonathan go into battle. Well, actually 3 sons of Saul. But they go into battle, and they are all killed. Saul he's at the place where it's like, he's standing there thinking, all right, they're gonna use and abuse, and he falls on his sword, right? And he committed suicide? Yes, he did. Okay, so now, and then he got a little help from somebody too, because he was in pain, and he had some servant boy come and help him out, which was a little tough for the servant boy, all right? But what I want you to see is, this is primarily where we're at right now, and we'll come back to a better chart than that in just a few minutes. Now, you cannot really measure any failure in David's life between the age of 17 and 30. You will see excursions in the flesh. Times of discouragement, the cave of Adullam. You will see a little bit of backsliding when he goes into, and I guess you could mark that as failure, but I see that as even part of the process of his wandering away from God for those 16 months when he went and joined the Philistines was all part of God's plan, in the sense that he learned a lot about his enemies by living with them, right? Now, that wasn't the best plan, I don't think, but he learned a lot about them, and he did kind of backslide, but you really can't find much failure in David's life between these ages. And it says that he was walking in the integrity of his heart. What is the best, I think the best definition for integrity that I've ever heard is the unswerving commitment to do the right thing. The unswerving commitment to do the right thing. Now, isn't that a little hard sometimes? Let's just be really honest. Sometimes it's just real easy to do the right thing, and other times, Forky Tail knows just exactly how to drop the hook and bait into the water for you, and he knows exactly how to get you rolled in cornmeal and fried in a skillet of butter. He knows exactly how to destroy your life. It was no different for David. But he was walking in the integrity of his heart. The unswerving commitment to always do the right thing. That's why he let Saul go. That's why he let Nabal go. Okay? So from his shepherd life to his king life, you're not going to find a whole lot of failure. All right? But now when it comes to Bathsheba, which we will talk about later, when it comes to Bathsheba, there's a turn in his life. There's a diabolical turn, and things begin to spiral downward in his life. Okay? Now you're like, well, now doesn't God forgive him and he move on? Yes, he does. We're going to talk a little bit about how God can forgive, but the scars are still there, right? And that's true of all of us. So just get this in your mind. For 50 years, he's a model of character and integrity. It's those last 15 to 20 years where things begin to spiral out of control, and I think that he dies a broken man. Not a miserable man, not a man turned on God, but a man who is broken because he realizes, I've gotten off trail from where I could have been. But yet, he dies, I believe, still joyful, at least in the Lord. Now, let me show you this one. I think this will be a little more helpful. Okay, so this is your panoramic view, right? Here we have the years from about 17 years old to 55 years old, years of triumph. And you can see here all the different things I have. If anybody wants this chart, I'll get it for you. But these are years of triumph and upswing in his life. Everything is going really well. Then we have the transgression. We have a fall here with Bathsheba, and then we start to have trouble in the kingdom. and traveled from 55 years old or so on to 70. All right, you're like, I didn't know he lived 70 years. I'll show you in just a minute. All right, so, and he didn't shepherd Israel all by itself. God led him step by step, which is kind of cool, and that's the next thing you're going to see. All right. Okay. This says David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years in all. Is that the right verse of it? Okay, he had reigned over Judah from Hebron for 7 years and 6 months, and from Jerusalem he reigned over Israel for 33. So what happens is, God says to him, and I'll show you how it's really cool how he seeks the Lord's heart. But he goes and when he finds out about the death of Saul, he goes and he serves as a kind of a offshoot king, basically the king of Hebron, or Judah, which is the southern part of Israel. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about who's in charge of northern Israel then. We'll talk just a little bit about that in just a second. But remember now, I've told you before, Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years finding out he was a nobody, and then 40 more years finding out what God could do with a nobody. Well, it seems to take that approach in everybody's life. He's done it in mine, okay, and he did it in David's life as well. So what he had to learn was he had to learn that there's the work God does for us, the work that God does in us, and then the work he does through us. You can't have one without the other. Now here's a cool question. He finds out about the death of Saul. How does he take the throne? Now he's been anointed king forever now, and it's like, all right, he's got an unswerving commitment to do the right thing, right? But he says, all right, now Saul's dead, and what would you do? Saul's dead, I've been anointed king, I'm going to get my job, right? And I'm bugging up there, and I'm going to start booting people out, and I'm going to clean house and take charge. That's not what he does. And that's what I think. I think it's absolutely beautiful. Here's how he handles this promotion. After this, David asked the Lord, okay, now after what? After the death of Saul and Jonathan and all of these, should I move back to one of the cities of Judah? Yes, the Lord replied. Then David asked, which town should I go to? To Hebron, the Lord answered. He didn't just storm the gate. He didn't just say, I'm going. He said, Lord, where do you want me to go? I mean, he actually waited on God and God's timing. He's been about 13 years waiting for this fulfillment of prophecy and anointing and everything else in his life. He was ready to be king, but God said, and he could have said, oh, wait a minute, Lord, hold it. Wait a minute. You anointed me to be the king of Israel, not part of Israel. He could have questioned God, he could have, but he didn't. He just said yes, and he did exactly what the Lord called him to do. So what am I saying? What is the lesson in this? Just that little verse. The lesson is this: even in taking a promotion, walk slowly, walk carefully. Make sure you're still putting God first. A lot of times we see a door wide open. Hey, all right, praise God, and we don't stop to say, now wait a minute, Lord, is this what you want for my life? Just because the door is wide open doesn't mean you have to walk through it. Okay? And that's part of what's going on here. So just so you kind of get a little catch of where he's at, okay? We have Israel all the way up here, all right? And Hebron down, this is in Judah, which would be your southern part, all right? He goes to Hebron, and he serves as kind of a restricted king. He's not really in full charge of anything yet. Just in Hebron, that's kind of the capital of Judah, all right? So he's there and he reigns for 7 years, all right? Then it's going to be really cool now of what happens and why he didn't get to go be in charge right away, all right? Now follow the thought here, because I'm going to take you just on a little bit more of a journey here. Is this the verse we used? Okay. All right, so this one says, David made Hebron his capital and ruled as king over Judah for 7.5 years. Now, what I want you to see is that David, when he was in Hebron, he made a few mistakes that he lived to regret. Okay? He made some decisions in his life that he lived to regret. A lot of people want to know, well, what are you going to talk about the polygamy in David's life? Okay? Polygamy meaning multiple wives. Well, first of all, I could tell you that there are many people in the Bible. They weren't all kings and that there were many people who had many wives. And we don't understand this. There's a verse in the Old Testament that talks about how let a king not take on many wives. It doesn't say, like for example, Solomon had how many? 700 wives. 300 concubines. Man, that's a lot of mother-in-laws and a lot of... Well, we'll just leave it at that. All right, that's a lot of, you're thinking, man, I have a hard time just keeping up with the one I got, right? But there's 700 wives. Now, David winds up having, if my count is right, and I've studied it out pretty carefully, David winds up having 18 wives and 10 concubines. How can that not be a sin? Well, you know what? Take that up with God. I can't really answer that for you other than that king. The Old Testament verse says, let not the kings take many wives. I think like Solomon, for example, because they will lead his heart away from God. Okay? And there were many who had many wives whose hearts weren't led away from God. Now this doesn't fit in our culture really good. Okay? My wife is not real happy if I want to date other women. Right? So I'm just saying, most of us fellas would get a beating, right? Come on, lady, put yourself in this. How would you like to be one of the wives of David? Just one. Okay? And you're like, oh, that boy was off his rocker. I'm not so sure, because when you study this out, it was a cultural thing for them. They did disobey. There was some disobedience there. But it did cost him some things, all right? It did cost him some problems. And here's, just while he was living in Hebron, let me just give you these really quick. There were, just in Hebron, he had 7 wives. He took 7 wives, all right? He had Ahinoam, where he got Amnon, the son from Amnon. So I'll give you the wife and the child. And by the way, he had 21 boys and 1 girl. 21 boys, 1 girl. 18 wives, 10 concubines. All right? I have all the verses for this. I'm not going to bog you down with, but if you want them, I can sure give them to you. Abigail gave him Daniel or Chileab. Maacah gave him Absalom and Tamar. Now you need to keep these names in mind because we're going to come back to them. We're going to be talking about Amnon and Adonijah and some of these different ones. Haggith gave him Adonijah. Abital gave him Shephatiah. Eglah gave him Ephraim. And then when he was in Jerusalem, Bathsheba gave him, who do we know Bathsheba? Solomon, right? Solomon, who was the wisest man who ever lived. Now just a minute. He was the wisest man who ever lived. But he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So I'm just telling you, to me that's not necessarily a wise decision. Okay? But I mean, for whatever, and we'll talk a little bit about his life a little later on down the trail. Now, there are a lot of other wives and a lot of other children. We're not really given the names of those wives, but there are, it's like in 1 Kings, 2 Kings, but there's a whole bunch of kids and stuff, and that's where I get all the numbers, all right? Now, David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and reigned 40 years in all. He had reigned over Judah from Hebron for 7 years and 6 months. And from Jerusalem he reigned over all of Israel and Judah for 33 years. That's where we get the total of 70. He died at 70. He reigned over the entire thing. So he reigned from Hebron, and then he reigned over this entire area.